Through the hollow door, a wanderer meets the gnome folk. The knotted willow cast twisted shadows across the border path to Idlemark, a lone soldier standing tall in its post between empires, a marker of lands divided by war. I had been trekking the border path since dawn, leaving my home in Albray's territory to make haste towards Bratton, one of the first border towns beyond enemy lines. Although I would not be welcome in such a place, my journey would take me no further than the fields and wastelands stretching for miles before the shorelands of Bratton civilization. Those of fine company do not tread these lands between empires, now inhabited by dens of thieves and scavengers. My presence would not be questioned, so long as I kept my head down and focused on my own trial. There had been talk, you see, spreading across Iceland, and now, as I stood careening my neck upwards to the knotted willow, I started to understand why. Its gnarled branches turned inwards within its trunk, curving almost in way of a smile inside of a nodular face. From atop its branches, sloping lower and lower towards its roots, hung vines, overgrown like the thickened hairs of a wizened man. Its leaves, the only colour for miles, glowing almost in the late afternoon sun. I stood by its feet, glancing at the dug-out hollow that ventured beneath its roots, a narrowed passage leading only towards darkness, darker than the shadows this weeping willow cast across the remnants of war. I ventured beneath, fastening the cowl of my hooded cloak so it fit snug to my face, shielding my eyes from the dust of a passage long forgotten, a tunnel leading from the hollow down into darkness. The cobwebs stretching across the sides of the hollow, packed so densely they'd started to resemble thickened buds of cotton, now wrapped themselves across the fabric of my clothes as I crawled deeper underground. Sharpened shards of flint strewn in the dirt marked my palms and the tops of my knees as I went. It wasn't long before the tunnel, once sloping, started to curve and narrow, pushing me from my crouched shuffling, shoulders stacked over my heels, to a full crawl, reaching with my elbows and using my arms to claw my way forward. I could feel the hem of my cloak catching on the edges of the tunnel, the narrowing passage pinching me in place, caught like a fowl in the jaws of a swallowing python. I breathed in, holding my breath in a last willing attempt to make myself smaller, to escape the clutches of the cavern as it swallowed me. Reaching forward, I felt nothing. Straining my eyes in the dark, I waved my hands blindly before me. The ground gave way, and I was falling, thrown head first from the passage into the empty space of the cavern beyond my reach. I hit the ground with a sudden thud, pain lurching through my arms, outstretched to catch myself from the fall, shooting down through my shoulders and into my spine. Seething, I lay quietly for a moment, attempting to catch my breath and sway the waves of panic. The drop couldn't have been more than a few feet, but the suddenness of the fall left me shaken for a moment. Steadying myself, I sat up, feeling the floor beneath me with the tips of my fingers. It was cold and sleek, different to the mud and dust of the passage I'd fallen from. The air felt different here too, the musky scent of the hollow fading, replaced by a scent that was floral and almost sweet, like raw honeycomb. I rubbed my eyes in an attempt to adjust my vision to the darkness. A blurred mass in front of me started to take shape, some kind of flat surface, a table cluttered with various stacked objects. Reaching out with my hands, I could make out the shapes of various books, cups and bowls, and a small kerosene lantern, an object rather out of place for a cavern beneath a hollowed tree. Although now my eyes had started to adjust, the space seemed large enough for the lantern to be safe. From the pocket of my choices, I withdrew a sharpened flint, striking it across the steel edge of the lantern to ignite its wick. The cavern glowed and was brought to life, no longer swallowed by darkness. The polished tile floors and panelled walls came into view. The space around me was clean and well furnished. It was clear to me now that this cavern was a place some creature must call home. Perhaps the most striking feature of the cavernous home was the small stature of all its furnishings. Spindle-legged chairs measuring up to my knees were arranged beside the low table. Parchment bound in thick leather, no larger than the palm of my hand, spanned the walls, arranged on planted shelves, barely balancing their contents. Wooden beams supported the ceiling, reaching in arches well above my head to keep out the weight of the earth just above me. Exploring further, pivoting from my stance in the centre of the room, I spotted a rug, woven from long grass in an intricate swirl, marking a path away from the main room of the cavern. It ran down the length of a corridor with various oaken doors lining each side. I wandered down the hall, turning to gaze inside of a few of the rooms. In one was a small bed with a headboard stretching towards the cavern's high ceiling. In another stood a clawfoot tub, just wide enough to wash one of my own feet. Beside it lay an empty water pail and kettle, perhaps for the fetching and heating of bath water. The grandest door in the corridor stood at the far end, embellished with floral carvings and intricate patterns. As I approached from the far end from the hall, a strange sound brought my advance to a halt. It was high-pitched and almost piercing, like early morning birdsong, and yet it was rather distinct and hushed, as if its source was being muffled. As I moved closer, the sounds merged into the low hum of whispers. "I done told you I'd seen summat, didn't I?" The voice was rustic, spoken with a sharp twang. It was unlike any dialect I'd heard in East before. "Pipe down, Ingvar, or else it'll hear us," another voice, lower than the first and far more assertive. I took another step towards the door. I realised now that it stood slightly ajar, allowing the choir of birdsong voices to seep through. "What'll hear us? I still don't know what it was I've seen," a third, trembling voice uttered. "It's one of them Empery folk, isn't it?" I pushed myself up against the door frame, positioning my eye to try and catch sight of the muttering creatures, but just as I shifted my weight, I fell forward, pushing into the door and closing it in the frame with a quiet but distinctly audible click. The voices stopped. Mutters. The pattering of footsteps sounded. The creatures were retreating. Mustering my courage and overtaken by the sense of urgency in my search for answers about this place, I flung open the door, calling out after the fleeing footsteps. "Wait! I assure you I am no threat, for I am lost, and not from these parts." I took a deep breath in, rubbing my eyes as sunlight waved into the cavern behind me and drenched my vision. Taking a step into the outside world, I realised I was well and truly lost. For the world I now found myself in was far from the wastelands of war, marking the border path to Idlemark. Steadying myself, I glanced behind me at the towering willow. Gnarled and knotted wood, hunched low to the ground, standing guard like a mourning widow. There was no doubt about it. This was the same weeping willow I'd encountered mere moments ago, although that moment now felt an age away. Moulded into the wooden frame, the intricately carved wooden door sat snugly, blending with the lined bark of the aging tree. The hollow was nowhere to be seen. There was nothing to do now but to keep moving onwards. Turning on my heel, I observed the new landscape all around me. Darkened, sodden trenches had been replaced by stretching fields, the grass tall and green, swatting at my ankles as I moved forward. I followed a road marked only by the flattening of grass, trodden by a parade of small marching toes. The fields here were unruly, choked by a thick brush of tangled weeds. Eventually, the path widened, the flattened grass slowly merging into a gravel-strewn road. In the distance, as I glanced either side of me, I could just about make out the shapes of several dozen buildings lining the sides of the road. They appeared to be constructed rather haphazardly, towering well above me and stacked with numerous floors. Outcroppings rested on roughly cut friezes, overhanging the lower tiers, wooden supports bowing under the weight of the vertically extending settlements. Looking closer, I noticed that much of the construction towards the base of the buildings looked older in years, additions made over time, the floors multiplying and stacking towards the sky, not dissimilar to the near-cascading piles of books I'd encountered back inside the cavern. The rows of piled buildings stretched on for several meters, merging closer, the gaps between each structure narrowing as the gravel path I tread began to widen. The wild meadows became more scarce as I entered the central square of the settlement I found myself in. The buildings were taller here, extending upwards well beyond my view. They surrounded me, encasing me in the centre of this unknown world. I stopped, turning in every direction, trying to make sense of this place, this town, this reality I had been transported to. Lost in my own racing thoughts, my vision felt distorted. In my startled state, it took me several moments to notice the man standing across from me, on the other side of the town square. But as I glanced upwards, I finally noticed the pointed, pale face staring back at me. In front of one of the buildings, perched on a bench laid out across a set of slate flagstones, the man sat folded, leaning forward, his eyes trained upon me. Wizened and almost crooked, he leaned across the arm of the bench, supporting the angled curve of his spine. Even from a distance, he appeared lean and gangly, his torso disproportional to the stoutness of his aged limbs. The man wore a short leather waistcoat, atop a white shirt and long flowing trousers, with suede boots curving inwards at the point of his toes. There was something about this man that felt amiss, although from so far away I could not quite make it out. His face snarled, nostrils flaring, carving sharp lines across his cheeks as his skin pulled taut over his cheekbones. The man stood, and now, as he struggled to get to his feet, I noticed what was so peculiar about him. He couldn't have measured more than 2 feet in height. The man was of gnomon kind. "Now," the short, wizened man declared, and out of the shadows they emerged, short, stout creatures moving in a wave, cascading over the square, muffled voices washing over me, a caucus of billowing sounds, louder and louder as they closed in on me. The towering buildings overhead seemed somehow taller now as the pattering feet advanced. "Wait! Truly, I mean no harm. I'm merely lost. I do not know how I got into these parts." "Quiet, you daft bugger," a familiar voice called out, standing to my left, a sharp twang in the parade of mutterings. "Norb, go on and fetch the rope for us now." Surrounded, I was forced to my knees. There must have been several dozen or so gnomes, now standing in the square. Stood in front of me, now eye level, was the source of the familiar tone. seemingly younger than the first I'd spotted, still looming towards the back of the square behind the crowd now surrounding me. This particular gnome was clad in a thick armour made of a woven chainmail. His hair was curled and unruly, plaited in strands and tucked behind his wide-set ears. His beard was unruly too, hanging from his chin in uneven clumps that reached almost to his steel-toed boots. Looking right at me now, he spoke once again. "Only a fool'd wander round these parts, lad. Asking for trouble you must be." In his hands he now held the end of a thick rope, thicker almost than his own wrists. Beside him, hauling the rest of the rope, a quivering figure stood. "Ingvar, move quickly. Master Frey is growing impatient." I recognised this second voice as another I'd overheard from behind the door of the cavern. "Shut your gob, Norb." Ingvar turned back to me, rope in hand. "If you're as harmless as you claim, I suggest you come quietly." Once bound upon my own wrists, the rope resembled nothing more than a thin woven twine, but the marching armour-clad gnomon escort that tailed behind me, as I was led further into the kingdom, was enough to sway any thoughts of escape. Leading the troop, Ingvar waded out through the streets, a short distance before me, with Norb trailing silently by his side. Further still was the wizened leader, who I now presumed to be Master Frey. The buildings were denser here, but no sturdier in construction, their main support stemming from leaning on one another as they piled upwards. Numerous ropes and cable lines had been strung between the houses here, hanging lights and banners, and even drying clothes in places. The streets were empty of common folk, aside from the odd peering face from an opened window. The soldiers that flanked me were the only creatures in sight. In the distance, our waypoint, the tallest structure of them all, and wider than the rest, a piling mess of construction, more resembling a mass of connected structures than a singular building. From the shared words of those who surrounded me, I gathered that our new heading was the home of Master Frey. I watched as Ingvar's footsteps began to slow, matching my own pace until he was walking beside me. I looked down to catch his words as he spoke. "You've never said your name, lad." I was surprised by this sentiment, one that was almost caring. "Ronan," I responded sheepishly. "Ronan of Eastland." I bowed ever so slightly as I spoke. Rattled by the unusual circumstances I found myself in, I was unsure exactly of what mannerisms to use. Politeness, despite my capture and hostage, felt like the safe way to go. "Eastland, eh? And what's an Embry folk like you doing so far from your kingdom?" Ingvar huffed. "Excuse me? I was heading to the border between Eastland and Idlemark. I wouldn't say I was far from home." "Well, your heading must have been wrong, lad," Ingvar cut across me as I tripped over my words. "You're far from the border towns now." "I'm sorry. So where exactly are we?" Norb shuffled back slightly, skipping a few paces ahead of me. I had to watch my boots closely so as not to step on the hem of his overcoat, a patched cloak strung loosely over top of his armour to shield from the wind. He turned to look at me, a cheeky grin painted across his face, as if my confusion elated him. "Stupid Embry doesn't know he's wandered all the way to Albion." The surrounding crowd guffawed and were quickly hushed by a disgruntled Ingvar. "Albion? No, I was headed to the path to Bratton. I've crossed no oceans. I didn't know what to say, for I knew no words would I speak could convince these creatures of my sanity. I was well and truly lost, transported by an unknown magic. As we approached the house of Master Frey, the crowd around me began to fall into rank. The once bustling crowd of armoured gnomes now stood in 2 ordered lines, leading up the steps of the house. To my left stood Ingvar, and to my right Norb. Perched by the entryway, hand clasped on the handle of the door, one just as ornate as that of the cavern, stood Master Frey. Nodding to Ingvar, we began to advance. As we approached, each pair of gnomon soldiers withdrew a long, sharpened broadsword, almost twice the height of each creature that brandished it. The subtle clink of metal as they withdrew weapon from hilt followed me as I began to climb the house steps, each one of my movements marked by the sound. Clink, clink, clink went the swords, until finally I stood a few steps below Master Frey, levelling our height so I looked directly into his greying eyes. "Sir!" Ingvar bowed, his head so close to the floor his nose grazed the top step by his master's feet. Frey merely nodded, and with a grumbling push swung open the door before us. The inside of the house was grander than I could have ever imagined. Golden pillars stretched up to the ceiling, meters above my head, several long tables weaved in between, stretching the length of the hall towards the back of the room, each one lined with a dozen or so chairs. And at the top of the room, raised on a platform, decorated with a colourful stripe of patterned tile, stood a tall throne with a long pointed top, almost like a wizard's hat. Master Frey strode across the room, perching himself in the chair, which was 3 times his own height. He looked out upon the room, beckoning towards me with an outstretched hand. I moved forward, stopping just beyond the platform and sinking onto an outstretched knee. I lowered my head. "Master Frey, sir, my name is Rowan of Eastland. I think it is clear to you that I am not from these parts." "Indeed, it is." His voice was croaky, his inflections not dissimilar to the Albion drawl that Ingvar possessed, and yet his tone was much lower. I recalled it as the last of the 3 voices I had heard from behind the cavern door. Clearing his throat, he continued, "And yet it is not clear to me what brings you here, Ronan of East." "Well, I assure you, sir, it is not clear to me either. I entered this land through a hollow on the border between empires, and then I found myself here." "You Empry folk often go messing with magic you're yet to understand. But, alas, that is far from your fault. Stay, why don't you? Rest a while, and before the sun rises once again, we can return you to the borderlands." With the help of dozens of tiny gnomon hands, the long tables of the palace, a far better title for this hall than a mere house, I decided, were laid ready for supper. Each setting had a plate, cutlery and glass flagon, each of which were far too small for my Empry hands. It had been pointed out to me by Norb. Stripped of their armour and swords, the gnomon folk now gathered at the tables, some bussing food from the back halls, whilst others toasted full, or half in my case, pints of mead. Where I sat, on the left of the room, I sat across from Master Frey, flanked, as always, by Ingvar and Norb. I'd come rather accustomed to their company at this point. The food laid on in the palace of that evening was spectacular, surprisingly no smaller in size than that of feasts laid by kings of my own empire. The tables were stacked high with roasted chickens, plates of potatoes and roasted vegetables, and various other delicacies I didn't recognize. I steered clear of one in particular, a glowing blue mushroom flaked with green spots. That appeared roasted, with a wilted and almost wrinkled texture. Norb sitting directly to my left, chewed happily on the mountain of mushrooms he'd piled on his plate. He'd removed his cloak and armour now, sitting bare-chested in his breeches as he attacked his mountainous plate. "I still don't understand," I began, turning away from Norb to focus my attention on Ingvar instead, "just how I ended up in this place." "You aren't the first of the Empry folk to come across the Weeping Hollow, you know," Ingvar snorted, bellowing words between mouthfuls of chicken, tearing at a whole leg with his yellowing teeth. Meat juices dripped down his chin, and he wiped absently at them with his leathers before continuing. "We never wanted to be involved in the war, you know. Our trials with Edelmark are none of your concern." "Never claimed they was now, did I? No need to be so snippy." "Us Empire folk, as you say, mean no harm to other kinds." I poked at the food on my plate, holding my fork in the tips of my fingers. The chair where I sat groaned slightly under my weight. "Never understood me. Fighting going on for centuries. There's no need, in my opinion." "Unfortunately, most creatures cannot spend their days frolicking in flower meadows. We have livelihoods to defend." Ingvar chortled, looking up at me. "I think your lot 'ud be much better off if you did a bit more frolicking and a bit less fighting, I say." The merriment stretched on far into the evening. Laughter echoed in the halls, chatter growing louder the more mead the little gnomon folk consumed. Hours passed, and eventually the many plates and dishes were cleared from the tables. Rising to my feet, I addressed Master Frey once again. "I'd like to thank you for your hospitality, but I'm afraid I should soon be on my way. I have a long journey home to Albrays ahead of me." "Very well. Ingvar and Norb shall lead you back the way you came. I wish you well, Ronan of Eastland." The wizened gnome gave one final bow and retreated into the bustling crowd of his folk as they continued to clear the remnants of our meal. Outside, the air had grown colder. The leaning towered houses cast more shadow over the already darkening realm. I turned to Ingvar. "This way," he muttered, and I followed, back through the overcrowded city and through the square, back into the outskirts of town, back through the tall grass meadows, and back to the hollow, or, in this case, and in this realm, the ornate wooden door where the hollow once stood. I turned to face Ingvar and Norb for the very last time. "I'd like to thank you for your time," I remarked, nodding slightly as I adjusted my cloak and prepared to depart. Ingvar grunted. "I hope you've learned, Ronan." I was taken aback by this. "Learned what exactly?" "Learned that these lands are far greater than the empires in which you fight, in which you swear to." His accent seemed weaker as he spoke now, more serious than I'd seen him in the last day that I'd known him. I shall remember your words." It was all I could think of to say. I turned on my heel and passed through the door. As I crawled out from the hollow, I found the lands as I'd left them, destroyed from endless war.